Dungeons & Dragons is the world's greatest role-playing game. I know this because Wizards of the Coast prints it at the bottom of all of their books. As such, there are millions of people around the world playing Dungeons & Dragons every day, creating characters, encountering monsters, and gaining experience points. However, when you have that many people taking part in the same activity that often, sometimes some of them are gonna do it wrong. All right, let's get this out of the way first. One of the strongest aspects of D&D is its versatility. There is no right or wrong way to play. It's extremely open source. Even the developers encourage you to tweak and modify the rules as you see fit. It's your game, it's your group. You can play it however you want. That being said, in this video, I'm going to explore one particular way that some people play D&D that, in my opinion, detracts from the game and isn't really in the spirit of how the game is supposed to go, at least not in its current incarnation. To sum it up in one imperative sentence for you, stop treating Dungeons & Dragons like it's a video game. In order to explain what I mean by that, I'd like to break down the core aspects of Dungeons & Dragons as a system. And by the way, this could be applied to other role-playing games as well, but D&D is the world's greatest one of those, so we'll use that as our main subject. There are a lot of different ways that you could try to break down a game as big and complicated as D&D. We're talking about a series that's had 5 editions with dozens of books featuring hundreds of rules and specifications, but I'm gonna really try to simplify things here and say that there are 2 fundamental aspects of the game as I see it: RP and G. RP, of course, is the role-playing, literally the playing of a role. Technically speaking, just about every game ever made, with the exception of abstract titles, involves the playing of a role. In The Legend of Zelda, you're playing the role of Link. And in Monopoly, you're playing the role of a capitalist scumbag. But I think we all understand that in Dungeons & Dragons, the term role-playing is taken in a deeper direction. Your character isn't just a pawn you control as an in-game extension of your actions and desires. Rather, you are meant to inhabit your character in the same way that an actor immerses themselves in a role for a play or a movie. To put it another way, in a non-role-playing game, your character's actions will almost always align with your real-life desires. In a role-playing game, your character's actions may very well conflict with your real-life desires, or might be so far removed from your real-life desires that it would be ridiculous to even draw the comparison. In reality, you probably don't have much stake in whether or not the elves and the dark elves learn to get along, or whatever it is. Going back to the theater analogy, role-playing in a game like D&D really is just a form of improvisational acting. In fact, they should have called it an acting game. That would have cleared a lot of things up for a lot of people. The second part of RPG is that third letter there, G, the game part of the game. In other words, all the rules, stats, numbers, modifiers, and restrictions that give Dungeons & Dragons its structure, that keep it from being just a whose line is it anyway sketch. In D&D, everything's made up and the points do matter. The RP and the G are what make D&D D&D. You may have your own preferences as to which of those 2 aspects you prefer, but I'd argue that you need both in harmony, at least to some extent, in order to fully experience everything the game has to offer. This brings us back to video games and the subject of this video. The one thing that tabletop RPGs will always have over digital video games is freedom of exploration. Even the most open-ended, creativity-encouraging video game is always going to be limited to some extent. One of the great selling points of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild was that if you saw a point on the horizon, you could travel there. You could travel anywhere. Nothing was off limits. And that's fantastic. But in a tabletop RPG, not only can you travel to any point you can see, you can also travel to any point you can't see. You can get a shovel and dig a hole straight down into the ground until you find something of interest. You can attempt to befriend a villain or slaughter a town full of innocents. You can sit and literally do nothing while the world moves on around you and wait for your character to die of old age. If you can imagine it, and the GM allows for it, you can do whatever you want. Again, the GM does have to allow for it, but they have the capability to allow for anything the players want. That just isn't true in a video game where there are hard and fast rules, restrictions, and limitations in place because the designers couldn't read the players' minds ahead of time and program a game to react to them. And that, I think, is the fundamental disconnect between the two mediums that causes some players to struggle. They fail to understand or engage with the potential of a truly open-ended role-playing system like D&D. If you're familiar with the role-playing world, you've probably heard the term munchkin, which refers to the type of player that doesn't really care about any of the role-playing. They're there to beat the game as best they can, get all the loot, get all the power-ups, kill everything they can see, and go home. And there's definitely a lot of overlap with what I'm talking about in this video with the Munchkin players, and I think a lot of it does draw from the video game medium, which is why I'm emphasizing that aspect of things so heavily in this discussion. Coming from the world of video games into role-playing games can be jarring. It's like telling a rat who's lived in a maze all its life that it no longer has to abide by those walls and can go in any direction it wants at any time. Sorry for comparing you all to rats. There are certain attitudes that video games instill in their players that are encouraged because within that medium, they generally lead to success. Attitudes such as wanting to engage in combat as often as possible in order to gain new abilities, treating NPCs as the quest givers they are, accepting their tasks as quickly as possible in order to get to the next section of the game, looting every nook and cranny for gold, treasure, and items with little regard for what they are or who they belong to, exploring the confines of every single area as thoroughly as possible to find potential hidden secrets, and by and large, treating the game as one big to-do list. This is especially prevalent in some large open-world style games. Rather than engaging with the world or story on a meaningful level, racing from one area to the next in order to check off a list of tasks to satisfy your lizard brain before the credits roll and you unlock every achievement and get all the dopamine you require until the next checklist of objectives is released as DLC. And all of those things are great and fine for video games, but all of them are also predicated on the assumption that you are playing in a fixed world which will not respond or change depending on your actions. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, but compared to tabletop role-playing, the impact you can have on a video game world doesn't even come close. If you carry those same attitudes over to something like D&D, you're doing a disservice to yourself, your GM, and your fellow players. Which isn't to say that they're all wrong all the time, but if you're only engaging with the game on that surface level, you probably aren't getting the most out of it. Here are some better habits that you might want to adopt. Instead of rushing into combat every time the opportunity arises, try to see if there's a different way around the situation. Also, consider what is to be gained from a combat. Are you fighting just because it's what's expected of you, or does this actually make sense in the context of the story and your character? Instead of talking to every NPC like they have an exclamation point over their head, then returning to get your reward and never interacting with them again, try getting to know them better. Find out who they are and why they want you to help them. Follow them around for a day, see what they do. Ask them to join your party. You never know where an NPC backstory might lead. Of course, you're going to want to be on the lookout for new items, weapons, and gear to add to your collection wherever you go. But in a living, breathing world, you shouldn't just wander into every stranger's house and smash their pots and open their chests to find out what they're hiding. It makes sense in a video game to take everything you see because most of the time, the only reason things exist in that world is for a player character to take and use. But in a GM-designed world, things just exist the same way they do in real life. Just because something's not nailed down to the ground doesn't mean you have to stuff it in your inventory. Think about what's important. If you're playing with inventory weight limits, that should help discourage this kind of behavior. And just as video game items are created for players to collect, video game areas are created for players to explore. If a corridor exists, there's almost always a reason for you to go down it. And don't get me wrong on this next point, exploration is an important and fun part of Dungeons & Dragons. The problem comes when players treat the world as a series of rooms to look inside of just because, rather than genuinely exploring them out of a sense of discovery. In the past, when I've played with pre-generated maps from the game, what would often happen is that players would see there's an area they haven't gone into yet, so they'd put off moving forward into the dungeon until they'd checked out every nook and cranny. And listen, when I play games, I'm the same way. I want to explore everything. That's just what I enjoy. But what sometimes ends up happening is that players don't explore organically, seeking out treasure, adventure, and plot hooks. Rather, the map becomes yet another checklist to cross items off of. Open door number 1, fight enemy, get loot. Open door number 2, solve puzzle, get key. And this can happen with or without a map. I just found that for some players, that makes it an easier habit to fall into. And that brings me back around to what I think is the ultimate sin of treating D&D like a video game, which is, again, not engaging with the role-playing aspects of the game. And that doesn't mean that you have to do a funny voice and dress up like your character. You can do those things if you want to, you don't have to, but you shouldn't just come to the table with nothing but stats and numbers going on in your head. If all you want is to grind out levels and get better loot, there are 1,000 video games that are better suited to your needs. With a tabletop RPG, you should be creative, use your imagination, find different ways to solve your problems, take the road less traveled, act based on your characters and your fellow party members' personalities instead of your own metagaming gamer brain. And I realize I'm focusing on player behavior in this video, but there's plenty that the DM could and should do to try to facilitate a more immersive experience. You've got to make a world worth exploring that feels alive. Reward players for acting in character and roleplay NPCs and events so it doesn't just feel like everything in the game exists solely to service the party. And of course, be willing to react to your players' ideas and allow them to incorporate those ideas into the world and story. It's a two-way street, and if either side isn't willing to engage on that level in some capacity, the result could be what I think is the worst-case scenario, which is the players and the GM just going through the motions, tossing enemies and attacks back and forth until the dungeon is finished, then on to the next obligatory town and dungeon until the campaign is over. That can be boring, and there's nothing worse for a D&D game to be than boring. So stop doing it. Stop treating D&D like a G without the RP, and stop treating D&D like a video game. Or, if that's fun for you and your play group, then, keep doing it. More power to you. If you have experience running or playing in a D&D group and you have thoughts on this subject that you'd like to share, feel free to leave them in the comments below.